Science is held to be the measure of reality, conquering gods, myth and magic. But postmodern thinkers are questioning our ways of looking at the world. After the break, set off in search of the real thing, the first of 3 programs guaranteed to upset your preconceptions. Kaleidoscope of provocative and disturbing images and arguments as we set off in search of the real thing.
You think God's just a false idea about knowledge and power. And you think his power tells modern man he can dispense with gods?
I'll tell you why. Our tools show we know what's what. Man's brain is carrying him up and on.
For man, no rest and no ending. He must go on, conquest beyond conquest. First this little planet and its winds and waves, and then all the laws of mind and matter that restrain him. Then the planets about him, and at last, out across immensity to the stars. And when he has conquered all the deeps of space and all the mysteries of time, still he will be beginning.
No end to our rational conquests.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Why do we modern humans make such good tools? Through reason, we've come to know what's really in the universe. We can blow away the clouds of strange beliefs that swirl around pre-modern humans. Pre-moderns? Take the Azandi in Central Africa. They believe in witchcraft. This oracle consists of feeding a chick a dose of poison.
Ulibangwa lineke himo na Rwanda bengi mugeta gukandoleza gakangwa yakiyo mwenu ni na raporo ulibangwa galipatu zile barkanani zo bengi mukushaka zile gudele bengi barungele bengi mugeta gukandoleza.
We know that the death of the chick tells us nothing about how the world behaves. But it's common for pre-moderns to see dangerous spirits in the mysteries of nature. The Mehinaku believe that this dangerous flute spirit controls the harvest. Very animal, these pre-modern beliefs. did I say pre-modern? Some pretty strange beliefs about reality still linger in our modern world. A reminder of our quaint past, or more sinister. The dark side of human imagination and feeling is chaos. Not nice to behold the potential for violent conflict in different kinds of belief. But there is a way to escape the stranglehold of superstition. Reality. True knowledge of reality will settle all disputes. If you want to know what really exists in fact, not in appearance, not in human thoughts, not in feelings, ask a scientist. He'll tell you the real things in the world are energy and mass, forces and electrons and neutrons and protons. Everything is just matter in motion. Faith doesn't build bridges. Engineering and science do. They're how we find true knowledge.
Only a 35-mile-an-hour wind is blowing, but this apparently sets up a rhythmic swinging of the bridge, which increases with each swing.
Of course, you have to get the engineering right, but science and reason are the way we do that.
Finally, the swinging road and the suspension cables give way and plunge into the water below. Fortunately, the only casualties were a car stalled on the bridge and a dog.
Unfortunately, unlocking the secrets of matter hasn't itself eliminated human violence. Sometimes it has made it worse. But even humans are just matter. Our beliefs and behavior are just so much energy and mass. True knowledge of matter may protect us even from human passions.
There is a real way that the brain is, and there is a real contribution to brain organization that's made by the DNA. And part of what we want to understand is, with respect to any individual brain, how it is the way it is, what makes it the way it is. Now, granted, there's so much we don't understand yet. We have so far to go. But there is a reality there. The brain is what it is. It is, in every sense, a physical structure with its own organization, influenced indeed by its environment, influenced indeed, even in utero, and constructed according to the rules laid down by the DNA. But it is a physical thing, and it can be understood. And to understand it would tell us something about ourselves. And that, I think, is something that many people find worrisome. That to understand oneself as a physical organism, as a biological thing, is maybe going to detract from one's humanity or from one's sense of human dignity.
No more human emotions distorting our knowledge of reality. We can see clearly now. No more gods, no more myths or magic. If only our pre-modern ancestors could see our power. A rocket taking off would tell them something about reality.
Stop. That's quite enough. There is a completely different rational way of looking at the world. You moderns think you're better than any other human being because you alone understand truth. We postmoderns know that there are different ways of seeing truth. Modern truth is just one way of seeing the world. Science is not the truth about reality. That's just the self-interest of a technological culture.
Science isn't neutral in its approach to reality. It's a way of describing reality suitable for achieving certain human purposes. Every human activity is a way of serving human purposes, and there is no such thing as nature's purposes, which science serves. Science, like everything else we do, is a way of doing things for our own benefit.
Okay, you've had your little joke. According to Rorty, what science tells us is in the world is really in human minds. That's crazy. Do I have to remind you of what happens when the energy and mass of a moving car meet the energy and mass of a stationary tree? You get reality.
We all know what happens.
People who say that science doesn't tell us about reality as it is in itself, reality as it truly is, sound as if they were saying there's no such thing as reality. They're not saying that. They're aware that you can kick things, that things can hurt you, that you can be crushed by physical forces, but they are saying that the way in which we talk about these forces isn't an accurate representation of anything. It isn't a way of saying how nature looks to itself. It's a way of saying how nature looks to us when we describe it in certain terms.
Even postmoderns drive cars.
Well, that settles that then. There is a physical reality. True knowledge consists of understanding that reality. It doesn't pay any attention to what we think or to our purposes. Planes don't fly because we say they do. We understand pretty well why planes fly.
Your winds are calm. Bear 1. Thank you.
We can only build flight simulators because we have pretty good knowledge of the bits of reality which affect planes. Forces are real. We're getting to know them. End of argument. Look, we've got some spare time now. Here's a selection of pictures for the viewers, something for all tastes. Meanwhile, why don't we slip out? I know.
Not so fast. You want to see the reality of mass close up? Here, a computer graphic of subatomic particles. You can't get much closer than that. But that isn't reality. As with any science, it's an interpretation. We got that particular interpretation from CERN near Geneva, where they make electrons crash into each other at vast speeds. Science only ever interprets. At CERN, it's by poking about in the subatomic shrapnel.
Science is about something outside ourselves, but the way in which we put questions depends upon the moment and the person who does it, the environment in which he lives. The answers are dictated normally by nature, if the experiment is correct, of course, if there are no mistakes made, but the interpretation of them is always in a framework of mind of the person or the scientist who have put the problem in front of themselves.
Science is like a baby. It's a human product. Sure, there's a real world, and we have our ideas about it. They are a map of reality.
Okay, let's be pedantic. Science is a human idea, but it could still be a true map. If an electron scan reveals that you've got a tumor, then you worry.
But to know that our map was true, we'd need to compare it to a non-human map of the world. But by definition, humans can't have a non-human view of the world. What's more, any map is a selection of information about the world from a human perspective. Here's one human perspective: time. The idea of time passing is a human perspective. Time only passes if you have an idea of change. If nothing changed, time wouldn't make any sense. From some perspectives, nothing does ever change. A hydrogen atom, if left alone, is exactly the same now as it was billions of years ago. We see change in the world, beginnings and endings. When does human life begin? At conception? At birth? It's a process of continuous development. Time is continuous. We make sense of the world by seeing shapes in it, which we map. Even science depends on how we see shapes in the world. CERN runs on human ideas. A fact isn't an object. It's part of the mental model we make of the world. A fact only exists within a human hypothesis. A hypothesis is a human idea of how various other hypotheses might fit together. Science is just one human way of making connections between shapes in the world. Calling something true means that it fits in the jigsaw of ideas we've put together.
We should really dismiss this view that the answer of science are true. The answer of science, if gotten in the proper way, applying the right method, are the most trustable one we can get in observing the physical world, and the method is such that until now it has helped us to comprehend more facts in a single framework.
Okay, so science is a human interpretation. But we're making progress towards better interpretations. One day we'll have a framework which explains everything.
But even if you make progress towards a very precise physical description of the world, that will still only be a selective human interpretation.
The building up of new frameworks by the merging of old ones, eventually discarding some which are no good or are proven to be false, is what is called in simple terms progress of science. And the question comes, does this progress bring us towards certainty about the reality? And the question we have to give, the answer we have to give to this question is rather not. It brings us a more unified view of the world around us. And this, hopefully, is also a closest view of the reality that we can perceive. But I think no scientist today can maintain that this point of view is the full reality. It is an approach to reality.
Science is an approach to part of reality. Who's to say that it's even the best one?
Well, I think if you can describe and predict the behavior of everything in the world, that's a pretty good way to understand reality. And we're working towards that.
The atmosphere can be considered a gigantic solar-powered engine which controls our daily weather.
Okay. Part of reality is like a machine whose workings you predict or perhaps even one day control. Is that the human truth about reality? I think you've forgotten something. What it is to be human. In the beginning is the Word. Humans are made by language.
People only become human beings through learning language and culture. We don't become just human. Just simply, we become human inside a certain culture, inside a certain language. Without language, some kind of moral understanding and so on, we'd just be animals.
Newly born humans are uniquely unfinished among animals. They're missing something. To mature, other animals only need time. But even after the 15 odd years it takes humans to mature physically, you still won't have an adult human, unless you've taught it language. A mature human, which understands and shares a world of values, owes almost everything to language. Language is how we describe and manipulate our models of reality. But language has some distinct peculiarities. It too is a kind of map. Language, like any other map, is a selection of information about the world.
The pictures are quite good.
And though language is something all humans may have in common, it's also what shows us most clearly that there are very different ways of seeing the world. Humans learn different ways of seeing reality, depending on which language they learn.
Just my kind of thing.
As a young blind boy discovers, language doesn't just describe shapes in the world. It describes the shapes that some particular humans see.
Is this the best that they can do? Like black and white.
Language always reflects human judgments about how to see the world.
It's quite hard, really.
Even how you see something as straightforward as color depends on where you are standing in the world, that is, which culture you belong to.
A good example of the way in which culture shapes perception is the way in which we perceive the rainbow as having 7 bands. And we believe the bands are actually there, whereas in fact it's a continuous variation in the colors. It has its particular historical origin in Newton's discovery that white light was actually a composite and not an elemental form of light. And in order to understand this discovery, he conceived of light as being like a musical scale in which the notes make a harmonious whole, which is white light. So he looked for 7 bands of distinct color in the spectrum, was unable to see them at first. But seeking help from a friend, he convinced himself that he could see 7 bands and coined the term indigo for the last band. In many other cultures, there are only 4 color words, many small-scale tribal societies: white, black, yellow, and red. One example is of a New Guinea highland people who obtained Reckitt's blue, the washing dye, and classed it as black, and used it, observed by an anthropologist, to paint part of a ceremonial house front. And according to the anthropologist, there was a very unsightly join between the black on one side and the blue on the other, and he pointed this out to the people, and they said, oh no, it's all the same color.
The engineering of brains is the answer. That gets around whether you think you see black or blue or indigo. No more false maps of culture when you understand the physiology of perception. Science gets rid of all the local variations in how we see the world. provides a language in which all human beings can speak to each other about everything in the world, including themselves. Of course, that won't stop us having feelings.
Something like falling in love is almost certainly, what else could it be but a property of the brain? And it's not something that we understand at this point, and it may not be something that we'll understand for quite some time. But it certainly has got to do with the nature of brain computation and the nature of brain representation. Now, to some people, it's true, I think, that this seems like a very unromantic thing to say, that perhaps all of the sort of wondrousness of falling in love will be destroyed if we understand the process in terms of its neurobiological substrate. We'll still continue to have the feelings that we have when we fall in love. If you know, for example, suppose you knew the precise details of all of the neurobiology of orgasm, do you think that would mean that orgasm would be any less interesting or wonderful? Well, probably not. You would still have exactly the same feelings. Why would the understanding detract from it? I don't see that it would.
Any language reflects human priorities about what to see in the world. Even science. It values prediction and control. Will the precise details of the neurobiology of orgasm give us the true relation with reality? Truer than the feelings we already experience? Who's to say that valuing prediction and control is right? It's good for some things. But if you use other values, you can see other things. Depending on which values you use, you can describe the world in very different ways.
The world is immensely various, and the fact that the natural sciences have been more successful in other areas of investigation misleads us to think that somehow or other the vocabulary of the natural sciences, or the sorts of entities described by the natural sciences, is the only vocabulary and the only entities there are. But that doesn't actually follow. Reality is various. It contains not only atoms and molecules and fields of force, but it contains balance of payments problems, victories and losses in crickets, plays on the London stage, university finances, professorial conferences, the pound in your pocket. I mean, it is immensely various, and it's a big mistake to suppose that somehow or other, because the pound in your pocket is constructed of molecules, that therefore everything that's interesting to be said, that can be said about the pound in the pocket, can be said in the vocabulary of molecules. Whereas, of course, it can't. I mean, the molecular structure of the dollar bills that I happen to have in my pocket is trivially uninteresting. What matters about those dollar bills is the role they play in human society, in human social exchanges.
160, 180, 200. How much is that altogether?
So, is there a true description of reality? True for what, you have to ask?
No, not if you make a habit of buying luxury yachts, it isn't.
So we'll hardly run out for a year or two yet. Blue money. Beautiful stuff, isn't it?
Let's get it under wraps.
Just a minute. I've always wanted to do this.
Distinctive ways of being human and having things which matter to us are partly created through language. Language not only creates human beings, it makes reality.
I've never asked that much from life, Pam. All I ever really wanted was to be a star.
We're made as we are by our language. It goes actually farther than one might think at first sight. It's not just that here I am, someone who speaks English in North America today, and therefore I have a different culture from others. You know, that sounds as though there's a world out there which is the same world for everybody, whether they're Tamil or Chinese speaking or English speaking, and we maybe just think of it differently because we speak these different languages and have these different cultures. But in actual fact, the difference is more startling than that. It goes farther than that. There are parts of the world where people are on a footing of equality with each other as citizens, and there are parts of the world where people are in hierarchical relations, where some people are nobles and other people are commoners and so on. And these realities are very different. I'm now talking about the social realities people live, the kind of relationships that they're in, the kind of love relationships they can have. These are very different, and these are constituted by language. That is, they wouldn't exist if they weren't articulated in language. There wouldn't be these differences if they weren't articulated in language. People have come across tribes of baboons, and so they have what looks like a social hierarchy, the dominant male or something of that kind, and the other males are afraid of him. And you can see something like almost a caricature of maybe human social life there. But supposing you ask the question, hey, that dominant male, is he a president, or is he a king, or is he a war leader, or is he... And suddenly you realize this question doesn't make any sense. You can't make this distinction about their society. The reason you can't make that distinction is, here we get to the nub, they don't make that distinction, and they don't make that distinction because they don't have language, to put it very, very simply, right? And so the fine nature of human relations only exists because they're constituted in language. In that sense, it's not just that, let's say, someone in China and myself live the same reality in different concepts. That's partly true about the sky and the rocks. But it's also the case that we actually are living very different social realities.
There are peculiarly human ways of behaving. Synchronized swimming? If you understand its rules, it probably makes sense. Reality consists of understanding rules which create meanings. Language is the way any human understands meaning. It both contains rules and is also how we formulate new rules, new values. Modern technological culture thinks that only one human way of seeing the world is true. It thinks that an understanding of prediction and control is not a human way of seeing the world. It thinks it has left behind peculiar human perspectives and found a way to see the truth, the world in itself, free of human values.
The idea of a world as it is there in itself is a self-defeating idea, because the world in itself means a world as it stands out of any relationship to our concepts, to our faculty of knowing. And that, by definition, is not a world we'll ever know. But I think it's a very important part of the whole enterprise of natural science, if we can think of it as a single enterprise, since the 17th century, that it's based on the idea of getting a grasp on the world from nowhere, it's been said, trying to free ourselves as much as possible from our own peculiarly human ways of feeling and understanding the world. Not that we'll ever do this totally, but the insight was that important things are out there to be discovered in the world, which we can only get our minds around to the extent that we unhook ourselves from our own peculiar reactions. So some things may seem to us to be more beautiful than others, something may seem to us to be more humanly welcoming than others in the universe, but the intuition of the 17th century natural science revolution was that these kind of distinctions may not correspond at all to what's really explanatorily important out there.
Getting our minds around some of the ways in which the world behaves has undoubtedly made science a very useful tool. But it doesn't mean we've left behind human perspectives. We can only live by our peculiarly human needs and passions and values. The urge to get outside human needs and passions is itself a peculiarly deep-seated human aspiration. It certainly isn't modern.
Of course, what it is totally to transcend the human perspective has always been a bit mysterious, because, of course, any language, any terms that people use to describe the world are going to be human terms. But I think that throughout the history of philosophy, certainly from Plato in the ancient Greek world, until I think really quite recently, indeed some philosophers would still share it, there was a kind of implicit idea that there was a vocabulary to which human beings could have access, which wasn't peculiarly theirs. It was somehow the vocabulary of the universe. It was the vocabulary in which, as it were, the world would, if it could, describe itself. And that what human beings, at their most powerfully rational, free modes, that when they were least encumbered by their limitations, their local cultures, what they could attain to was a kind of glimpse of the vocabulary in which the world could describe itself.
To leave the human body with all its material sensations and limitations behind, to get to know the world truly in itself. You'd think it was a religious idea. Actually, in a way, it is. At the beginning of the 16th century, Galileo proved that the Earth moved around the sun. Usually we think that that was it for ideas about reality based on religion. Science replaced the church as the source of knowledge. But much of the philosophical basis for the Enlightenment was provided by a pious Frenchman called René Descartes. He thought that truth couldn't lie in any potentially flawed human view, even if offered by the church, and must lie in the ordered physical world as created by God. He set out to provide a firm foundation for knowledge, which would succeed by removing all traces of human error and doubt to get at the truth about this ordered world. Objective, scientific study of the world was the solution. And though he thought that he had made a foundation for knowledge, he still took it for granted that a God had created an ordered world.
You see, it's very interesting that Descartes, often thought to be the first of modern philosophers who took on board a lot of this problem. Curiously enough, his philosophy, although it's individualist and skeptical and tries to do all this thing of putting science on a foundation and all that, it comes back in the end to God. What the world was really like for Descartes was the world as it seemed to God. And the way in which we could transcend our human limitations was by making contact, or having an assurance we could make contact, he thought, with God's own view of the world. Now, of course, once you've lost all those formulations, you don't believe anymore that, maybe you don't believe there's a God. Certainly you don't believe that what God's up to is having a picture of physics, which we'll be lucky enough to dial into. I mean, that isn't how it works anymore. Once you've got rid of those pictures, it then, of course, becomes problematic what the description of the world which is least dependent on our local human preoccupations, is.
Science, too, is dependent on local human preoccupations. It isn't God's own view of the world. Many people now even think there's a vacancy for God's job. But you moderns think that your reason and power make you gods. You're the intelligence presiding over an ordered creation.
I think one reason for abandoning the Enlightenment conception of science as bringing us closer and closer to reality as it is in itself is it's a pretentious view. It suggests that someday human beings will be like gods, and it would be better just drop the notion of human beings becoming divinized and just say human beings will become, with luck, more and more successful at getting done the things that human beings want to do. And science is just one more way in which human beings increase their ability to fulfill their needs. They're never going to get away from those needs in the way in which God is pictured as having no passions and no needs. We will always be the kinds of creatures we are now, in no more or less direct relation to reality than the relation we're already in.
Human beings make different worlds out of different ways of valuing the world. Which is the most real? Meaningless question, until you say which value you're prizing. The idea of one universal human truth, free from human values, is a mirage.
But that could be an utter nightmare. There's nothing to stop human imaginations running riot. Look, we all know that there's no one model for human beauty. This is how Nuer women of the Sudan improve on nature. They have very different values from us. You're saying that there's no way we can find a language, a value, which all humans can share to talk about the world. But let's try. Be modest. Let's just start with the most basic aspects of physical reality. Things fall for everybody. If we keep it simple, we can agree about what's in the world. Forget about all of the other strange things people believe.
But you can't even do that. You can't have an entirely innocent view of the world. For many people, what they see in the physical world, witchcraft, for example, is conditioned by their views of what it is to be human. They'll say that they can't just abandon everything they believe without ceasing to be human.
Gubori kambira ngai meti ya alikishinga ya mangwe. Pedunga ya makambira meti ni kisuka vuko. Onija ani sabura. Mina mekono. Kaula bana. Kida kumogiri moyo. Mina poni ne. Mina adre mina aje na ko etimbara. Mina mi digini akolo ni suje vura.
Evans Pritchard confronted this problem, what exactly it was that led the Azandi to consult the poison oracle. What was it that witchcraft did in their world? And he shows that the Azandi understand perfectly well how to make pots, how to build granaries. They know that if you don't get the air bubbles out of the clay, the pot will burst. If you don't get stones out of the pot, it will burst. They know that if you don't repair the stilts that the granaries are placed on, they will be eaten away by termites and they will collapse. So they have an empirical knowledge. But they also have a sense of the value of human life, that no healthy adult could possibly die by accident. This is something which is inconceivable to them. So the problem that witchcraft deals with is to explain why healthy adults sometimes die, or why healthy adults sometimes suffer consistent misfortune. And as Evans Pritchard saw it, they were explaining what he regarded as coincidences. It wasn't a problem for him that, for instance, a man might one day be asleep under a granary to avoid the midday sun, and the granary collapses and kills the sleeping man. Evans Pritchard regarded that as an accident, coincidence. But for the Azandi, it was a problem to be explained. It's not a problem for our culture. It's a problem which arises from the value that the Azandi attach to human life. that they attach a greater and a different value to us. And there's something left after the empirical explanation which still has to be dealt with. And that is why that man was asleep under that granary on the day it collapsed. And that is what witchcraft explains.
You moderns value control and mastery. But claiming that only prediction and control show truth dismisses other human views of the world, which value other ways of seeing ourselves. There's no neutral description of a human being. There's no fixed point where we can stand and say, this is the truth about humans. How we see anything depends on what we are choosing to value. There may even be ways of valuing things which allow you to see God. There's no way we can rise above human views and values to find a neutral way of choosing between them. Modern science hasn't made us superior to pre-moderns by giving us a better grasp on truth, unless you confine truth to the values of science. Modern culture isn't better. It's just different.
When it comes to comparing styles of life or possible cultures, say a scientific culture or a culture that centers around art rather than science, conflicts between such cultures can't be settled on neutral grounds. There isn't a tribunal you can appeal to that will tell you whether it is more rational to be scientific or more rational to be artistic. There's no notion of rationality which is neutral between these alternatives. Rationality is simply what a given culture thinks is reasonable, and what a culture thinks is reasonable depends on the particular historical traditions of that culture. The West is no better off than any other culture from that point of view. We don't have a handle on something called neutral rationality. We simply have cultural practices built around the sciences in the way in which ancient China had cultural practices built around art and poetry, and certain primitive cultures still do. To decide what form of life is best for human beings is a matter of imagination rather than a matter of the application of a neutral faculty called reason. To be aware of other cultures is a matter of imaginative projection rather than comparing them with an antecedently known criterion for what a human community ought to be like.
What a prospect. Where will our differing human passions and values lead us? To chaos. We're stuck with our messy human world, with different views about what's important. That can only be dangerous.
We're such little creatures. Poor humanity is so fragile, so weak. Little animals. Little animals. And if we're no more than animals, we must snatch each little scrap of happiness and live and suffer and pass, mattering no more than all the other animals do or have done. It is this or that. All the universe or nothing.
We humans can't have all the universe. But just because we're not gods, it doesn't mean we're stuck with nothing and can't avoid violence.
What's the alternative? If we can't have reliable universal knowledge, then we're stuck on this earth with our conflicting claims about different realities. How can we possibly avoid violent struggles over equally unjustifiable values and beliefs? Chaos.
There's another expedition in search of the real thing next Sunday at 8:30 on Channel 4. There's an unusual Channel 4 booklet to accompany this series. It's written as a discussion of the nature of truth between various characters, ancient and modern. If you'd like a copy, send a cheque or postal order for £2.50 payable to Channel 4 to The Real Thing, P.O. Box 4000, London W3 6XJ.